Hello, Robs. We're back with Herzl. Herzl, good. Herzl, Herzl, as I remember him. Erwin Rosenberger, or Rosenberger, one of the two. Too loud. I gotta go turn it down. All right, Robs. 4. I soon learned that Herzl had not forgotten my speech at the Zion Society. Rosenbaum of the Jewish Student Society Unitas reported to me that Herzl had told him that fellow Rosenberger should give propaganda speeches. He would inspire his audience. He's a real popular orator. My friend Lerner from the Akademische Leschal reported a similar remark by Herzl. Not long afterward, I shook hands with Herzl for the first time. As he was leaving a meeting, he extended his hand to say goodbye. I introduced myself by name. I already know you, he said in his winning manner. I have heard you speak. Another time we briefly exchanged greetings at the Ronischer Hall. The occasion was a festival evening attended chiefly by students, but also by prominent representatives of the Jewish community. I was sitting among my comrades from the Lesahale, Lesahal, waiting for the evening to begin when the word was passed from mouth to mouth. Herzl has arrived. He was escorted into the hall by the medical student I. Shalit, a member of the Student Society Kadama. We students rose from our seats. As Herzl came up, looking to see who was present, he stopped in front of me, extended his hand, and asked in a friendly way, "How are you?" Shalit broke in. He has just fought a mighty battle. He was referring to a speech I had delivered not long before at the Lesahal during a debate with the Free Association, a social democratic student club whose spokesman we had invited to our hall. A greeting by Herzl, even if it was only a brief "How are you," was regarded among us students as a signal honor which lent prestige to the one thus addressed. I did not fail to note the incident down in my diary, and some of the pleasure I felt then returns to me as I read the entry today and as I write these lines. What do you got, bruv? And now I want to make a confession and reveal a secret which I confided to only the very closest of my school comrades. I wrote poetry. I had been attracted to the muse since early youth, and in my first semester at the German University in Prague, I had the satisfaction of seeing my productions printed for the first time in a Berlin magazine. In Vienna, where I continued my studies, the Deutsches Dichterheim published my verse, and some of my small prose sketches appeared in the Wiener Tagblatt. Yet, despite these successes and the appreciative letters I had received from the editors concerned, I continued to have gnawing doubts about my literary ability. One day, sitting in my room, I decided to ask Herzl for his opinion. He was, after all, a prominent writer and surely qualified to judge. Accordingly, I drew two unpublished stories to judge. Wait. Accordingly, I drew two unpublished stories out of my briefcase and sent them to Herzl with a request For an appraisal. I received the prompt reply, one which is noteworthy in more than one respect, for the advice he gives an inspiring writer for his concept of what a writer is, and for the care with which he read the manuscripts, despise the many claims on his time. The letter, written on the stationery of the new free press in a small, graceful hand, without a single correction, reads as follows. March 26th, 1897. Dear Herr Rosenberger, I carefully read both of your stories because I have taken an interest in you since I heard you speak so well and skillfully. As a rule, I give no definite answer to inquiries like yours, for it is assuming a great responsibility to advise a young man either for or against the literary career. I believe you have talent, although neither of the stories is a finished product. As I read them, I reflected on what it is you lack. I believe it is the right models. We rarely or never begin with our own ideas alone. It is my impression that you have followed poor models, especially in The Theft. It contains many tasteless passages. Though the historical top hat collection and the punchline at the end are not bad, I find the unlucky one better. It is a Mark Twain like notion, though it becomes trite toward the end. My advice is thus as follows. Read, but read only proven masters. You will know who they are from the fame they enjoy after the exaggerated praise and blame of contemporaries has died away. Don't become enamored of the uncertain moderns. Seek out the simple ones. One learns most from the simple ones. Only after that should you seek yourself, and then you will find yourself. Keep deleting. Above all, however, you must not neglect your serious professional studies. Whatever one seriously Whatever one studies seriously gives one the inner support that every sensible man needs in life. The writer, too. A writer, in my opinion, is nothing special, merely a more intense, or if you wish, more profound, sensible man who expresses his thoughts and feelings so that they may be understood by all. Vir bonus scribendi peritus. Does this advice seem to involve too much delay? It is, to the best of my knowledge and in all good conscience, correct. If it does not quite satisfy you today, then keep this letter in a few years. You will find that I have not advised you badly. Above all, learn. With Zion's greetings, yours truly, T.H. Herzl. His letter, with the deep interest that it shows, moves me even today as I read it. The phrase historical top hat collection refers to a short story which I had submitted to Herzl. The protagonist of the story was an eccentric who had amassed a collection of top hats for his own bizarre reasons. 5. For several weeks, I saw very little of Herzl, and then only from a distance. Then an unexpected event occurred. On Sunday, in May 1897, at about 3 in the afternoon, a friend of mine named Steiner, a student at the Academy of Art, came to my modest room at number 3 Mosergasse. Steiner was approximately my age. I was then 22. He was a sculptor, and I knew that he was making busts of Herzl's parents at that time. Upon entering, he told me that he had an important message to deliver. The conversation which follows is taken from the notations in my diary. You are bringing an important message, I asked. From whom? Guess. I am not sufficiently omniscient. My friend stretched me on the rack a bit more and then said with an air of importance, Dr. Herzl sent me to you. Indeed, He invites you to visit him at his home in the Berggasse. I was utterly astounded. Dr. Herzl? I am to visit him? Why? Steiner replied with a significant smile. You will learn that from him. When shall I go? Right now, if you can. I will accompany you to the front gate. It is not far from here. My heart was pounding as I climbed the stairs at number 6 Berghaus. Herzl came to me. All right, I can't read. Herzl came to meet me in his study and greeted me as though I were a good friend. He was wearing a simple gray lustring jacket. His wife sat writing at a small table by the window. I was introduced without ceremony, whereupon Herzl asked me to take a seat next to his desk. It was my impression that Frau Herzl had been informed as to why I was there. Seating himself at the desk, Herzl offered me a cigar. When I replied that I didn't smoke, he expressed astonishment. He then set about preparing his cigar in a rather elaborate manner. I felt that he was considering how he should begin the conversation. At last he broke the silence. How do you stand with your medical examinations? He knew then that I was a medical student. Thus far, I replied, I have completed all the examinations on time. 5 months ago, the first thero, ther, theoreticum. Before that, the practica. In other words, the whole first rigorosum. I tried to seem at ease. In reality, I was more ill at ease during this first interview with Herzl than I would have been with anyone else. Herzl started to talk about medical science and its services to humanity. I recalled with amusement that I had first chosen the field of medicine because, as a gymnasium student, I had hoped it would be possible, with the aid of a scalpel and a microscope, to find the soul somewhere in the brain, perhaps. Since then, I had come to realize that the matter was not so simple. Do you hear, Julie? Said Herzl gaily to his wife, pronouncing her name in the French manner, Julie. He wanted to discover the soul. Frau Herzl looked up, nodded assent, and went on writing. Herzl was in no hurry to get the matter at hand. To get to the matter at hand. It was a leisurely conversation which offered me no hint of what he was aiming at. I was growing increasingly curious as to why he had invited me. Surely not to chat in this fashion. He allowed occasional pauses. There you go. Now you're completely gone. He allowed occasional pauses to arise, during which he pensively sharpened a pencil or blew clouds of cigar smoke. His wife called him over to her table. He read part of the letter she was writing and made a few suggestions on how to go on, which she accepted with thanks. At last, after returning to his desk, Herzl told me the following. He was about to start publishing a magazine, a weekly which would propagate the idea of a Jewish state and work for its realization. Dr. S.R. Landau was the executive editor, and Shallot, the medical student from the Kadama Society, was also a member of the editorial staff. There had been a sudden development, however. In the next few days, probably the very next day, Shallot was to leave for the Balkans as head of a group of Jewish medical students who, at the outbreak of the Greek-Turkish War, had offered their medical services to the Turkish army. Herzl asked me if I would like to fill in for Shallot on the magazine. He intimated that I might remain as a permanent member of the editorial staff, together with Shallot, after the latter's return. Gratified by the flattering proposal, I accepted at once. But you must not neglect your medical studies, said Herzl emphatically. Shallot also had to promise me that he would be sure to prepare for his medical examinations. Now, as to the question of salary, I interrupted to say that the question of money was immaterial, and that the opportunity to aid our noble cause would be ample reward for me. But Herzl replied firmly that accepting my services without pay was out of the question. If I insisted on this, then we could not possibly come to terms. The magazine might just as well not accept payment from subscribers, he argued. Hence, I agreed to take the amount that had been fixed as Shallot's salary, 40 gulden a month. The conversation now turned to my editorial duties. I know that you can write, said Herzl, but you have more to learn. I want to be your advisor, but you must take my advice. This admonition was utterly in a kindly paternal tone. I had already become warmly attached to Herzl at this first real meeting without intending to. He had increasingly captivated me. He asked me next whether I had a notebook. I drew it out of my pocket. Could I take shorthand? Yes. At this point, Frau Herzl remarked, while continuing to write, shorthand must stand you in very good stead. It certainly does, I replied. I would have a great deal of difficulty keeping up with the lectures at the university were it not for my shorthand. So she is following our conversation, I thought. Then she is interested in the subject. And now a few words about the impression which Frau Julie Herzl made on me at this very encounter. An impression, I might add, which further contact confirmed, and I never had to revise. 6. Frau Julie Herzl was a simple, unaffected woman who had no inclination to play the great lady. Her behavior was that of a woman of the well-to-do Viennese middle class. When I saw her for the first time in May 1897, I judged from her appearance that she was about 32. But I later learned that she had been only 29, as if that was a huge difference. She had a medium figure with a slight tendency toward plumpness. Looking at the Herzls, one might have said they confirmed the old adage that opposites attract. He dark-haired, she fair-haired, with light-colored eyes. With her regular features, which easily broke into a friendly smile, Frau Herzl could be described as very pretty. Her complexion was delicate, fair, and flawless. She moved in a naturally composed manner, never with undue haste or agitation. At this very first visit, I noticed that Frau Herzl was thoroughly familiar with the Jewish state idea and with her husband's plan to publish a magazine. And her demeanor during my conversation with Herzl seemed to indicate that she sympathized with his aspirations. Several more times while we were talking, he interrupted with a "Do you hear, Julie? Do you read many newspapers?" Herzl asked me at one point. "No, but I can do so from now on." "Did you know," he inquired, "that the Union recently held a meeting?" I was there. It was in the banquet hall of the Lower Austrian Chamber of Commerce and Industry. He nodded. "Write a report on it." The Austrian Israelite Union was a society of Jewish students or citizens who sought to protect the interests of their hard-pressed co-religionists. I asked Herzl what the physical appearance of the manuscript should be. He took a folio sheet of paper from the desk, folded it once lengthwise, and explained, "One half should contain writing, the other should be left blank for possible insertions and corrections. I write on the left-hand side. The back of the sheet should contain no writing." I nodded to indicate that I would follow this procedure. Next, I noted down, as Herzl gave them to me, the sections of the new magazine which I would handle. Club news, a weekly calendar, a column entitled World Chronicle. Hardly the sort of work that would require much literary talent, I thought to myself. Not for a moment did it occur to me that I might not prove equal to the demands made on me. I took it for granted that I would quickly learn the ropes in my new journalistic pursuit. The conversation continued a while longer as we talked about the magazine and other matters. Finally, after arranging to meet Herzl the following morning at 8:30 or 9 at the Wiener Mode, I took my leave, kissing Frau Herzl's hand before I went. The Wiener Mode was a fashion magazine whose printing facilities we were to use for our weekly. I could indeed call it that now. 7. I left Herzl's house with a feeling of exhilaration. I was an editor. Just 2 hours before, I had walked through these same streets as an ordinary medical student, and now as an editor. Quite a step up in the world, I thought. I had always had great respect for the position of an editor. I saw in him a man who could write whatever he pleased and see it published, who could accept or reject at his own direct discretion the manuscript submitted by others. In my case, moreover, I was an editor of a special kind. I had been favored by unusual good fortune. My editor in chief was Theodore Herzl. I had the joyful feeling of a military officer who is privileged to serve under a revered commander. If previously I had esteemed Herzl highly and sympathized with him, after our conversation I had become extremely attached to him. His engaging manner and the interest he showed in me had won my complete devotion. I was ready to go through fire for him. I was uplifted by the thought that I was to be permitted to join in Herzl's work to help build the Jewish state. Until then, I had made my modest contribution to the Jewish cause with only the spoken word. Henceforth, I hoped I would be able to employ the written word instead and thereby exert a far wider influence. Filled with these thoughts, I directed my steps toward the Café Jageroff on the Porzellengasse, a favorite gathering place of Jewish students. There I found Steiner, to whom I reported the outcome of my visit to the Burgras, or the Burgas. He evidently had nothing more pressing to do than to pass the news around the cafe, so that on my way home soon afterward I was accompanied by a number of friends who congratulated me and prophesied all manner of good things. But back in my room, I ruminated over what had happened. I had a suspicion that the editorial position Herzl had offered me was by no means intended to be temporary. Would he have inquired so urgently about the status of my medical examinations if he had merely meant me to interrupt my studies for a short time? And another indication, I had learned at the Café Jageroff that the Jewish medical expedition was to leave the following evening for Salonika in Turkey, and that 2 days earlier Shalit had received his final instructions from the Turkish ambassador in Vienna. Consequently, Herzl had had at most 2 days to consider whom he would name to the editorial staff in Shalit's place. From this, I might well conclude that he had not made the decision to choose me in the past day or two, but had had me in mind previously. However that might be, I now had to write the report on the Union, which Herzl had requested, and I had better take care that it was not too sarcastic in tone. This latter self-admonition was very much to the point. In our juvenile fashion, we students regarded the respectable Jewish citizens who made up the Union as Philistines, and we were fond of appearing uninvited at their meetings and expressing our opinions with loud interruptions or even more violent demonstrations. In fact, most of these good people were anything but Philistines, but we held it against them that, following the practice of the Jewish community at that time, they belonged to the Austrian Liberal Party, instead of sharing our faith that Jewish salvation lay in a nationalist separatism which aspired to create an independent Jewish commonwealth. After completing the report, I wrote a long letter to my parents who lived in the town of Komatau in Bohemia, telling them that Dr. Theodore Herzl had appointed me an editor of his new weekly magazine. I also said I was hopeful that my medical studies would not suffer as a result. I had a university comrade, Julius Wolff, a member of the Jewish Student Society Libanonia, who was a sincerely devoted friend. We had worked side by side at the dissecting table, and in the laboratory, and together we had crammed many a bit of medical lore for our examinations. When I told Wolf, who was a diligent student, about the sudden turn of events, is that a word? Or is it supposed to be events? He shook his head anxiously. And your rigorosen? Your medical studies? I'll manage them all right, I replied confidently. Do you think so? Of course. I'm not so sure, he said, shaking his head once more. Take care that you don't idle away your time in journalism, so that all the work you've already done is lost, together with your doctor's degree. All right. These are pretty short sections. 8. The morning following my interview with Herzl, Monday, May 31st, I started out for the Wiener mode, where our weekly was to be printed. Riding on the trolley, I wondered whether Herzl would be satisfied with my work. He had, so to speak, taken a chance on me, making me his editorial colleague without really knowing me, a mark of confidence for which he as yet had no real basis. I resolved not to disappoint him. The name of our magazine was to be Die Welt, the world. What would it look like? What format would it have? Big, small, thick, thin? Herzl had not said a word on the subject. I admired the single-minded energy which had led Herzl to found the new magazine, the second stage on the road to the Jewish state. The first stage, or rather the starting point, had been the book The Jewish State. Now there was Die Welt to open the way for a further advance. In today's world, the written word was truly a fighter in the front lines. At 8:30, I arrived at the Wiener mode, where I was told that Herzl was on the second floor. I found him in the office of Herr Steiner, general manager of the fashion magazine. Herzl introduced me. Steiner was a man of 38, though his beard made him appear older. Of less than medium height, he expressed himself fluently and was agile in his movements. I was struck by the way he trilled his R in the manner of the stage. He was a recent convert to our cause, who had been fired by Herzl's example and also by his book, under the name York Steiner. He was to a contributor, I think that's supposed to be, he was to be a contributor of Die Welt. As soon as Steiner had left, Herzl asked, "Did you bring the report on the union meeting?" I handed him the manuscript. He read it slowly and searchingly, then looked at me and said, "It's good." Then he took his blue pencil and began to strike out lines. In my diary, I find the observations that he struck out more than was necessary. Today, I strongly suspect that he knew what he was doing. As I watched with interest, he deleted parts and linked up what was left with short transitions. The result of this operation, a mixed product of two authors, appeared in the first issue of the magazine in the column headed The Week. After editing my report, Herzl picked up a long strip of paper which contained printed matter in the form of a newspaper column. "You can be very helpful here," he said. "I am about to read the galley proofs." Noting my questioning look, he added, "Do you know what a galley proof is?" I confessed that I didn't. "Take a look," said Herzl, pointing to strips of paper still wet with ink. They're preliminary impressions of the type. We have to read them for typographical errors before the final printing. Do you know how to read proof? Again, I had to say no. Herzl was neither surprised nor disappointed. "I'll show you. Read it with me. There's a typo already. You strike out the incorrect letter with a special mark, thus, and write the correct one in the margin next to the mark, thus." In a patient, friendly manner, like a kindly teacher instructing a pupil, Herzl initiated me into the technical rudiments of my new work. Then he went down to the print shop to give some instructions. When he returned, he found that I had succeeded in botching a whole galley proof. Not satisfied with merely making the correct letter in the margin, I had written the entire word. Herzl sat down and transferred the corrections himself in the proper form to the other margin. When he noticed that I was somewhat embarrassed by my awkwardness, he said, in a friendly way, "It doesn't matter. You'll learn how to do it." He acted more like a friend than like a boss. Indeed, during all the time I worked with him, I never heard him utter an unfriendly or peevish word. Yet I felt very shy with him that day. Why? I can think of no adequate explanation. Herzl certainly did nothing to make me feel that way. On the contrary, he was the very soul of friendliness. Was it force of personality? That is an expression that really explains nothing. The fact is, I was not the only one who had ever lost a bit of his customary aplomb in Herzl's presence. I had seen both young and old act self conscious with him. My friend Itzhak Lerner, who was approximately my age, once said to me, "When I am in Herzl's presence, I feel like a child." Herzl gave me some additional pointers for my work that first day at the Wiener mode. The galley proof on which I made my first corrections is still in my possession. Obviously, even in those very first days, I felt a desire to preserve papers which bore a few marks in Herzl's handwriting, or which, through their association with him, conjured up memories for me. The galley proofs of Die Welt were curious looking, to say the least. They had previously served as galleys for the Wiener mode, and consequently, they contained all manner of illustrations and text from that periodical on the reverse side. Thus, on the back of the historic galley already referred to, I noticed a picture of a head cushion in Gobelin satin stitch, and an article on the linen trousseau of a Viennese upper class family. Type which had sung the praises of an English walking and visiting dress of dark blue braided material was used 2 days later to proclaim a serious political program. Hidden behind the galley of a piece of heavy polemics by Max Nordau is a pretty young Wienerin wearing a hat in the current fashion. Piled high with flowers, feathers, and ribbon loops, the young lady obviously has no idea what is going on behind her back. Herzl's speaking voice was baritone. I could not possibly imagine his otherwise. With a clear, thin tenor or a booming bass, his voice of pleasantly medium range and an even modulated strength was an inseparable part of his personality. Indeed, it was one of the qualities that made him attractive. His mode of speech and his pronunciation were unaffected and free of any trace of dialect. His spoken German gave no clue as to his geographical origins. It was the pure yet unforced German in use among cultivated people. Whenever the language enjoyed currency, wherever the language enjoyed courtesy. Currency, not courtesy. At home, Herzl's wife and children spoke the same, normal German. 9. Let's hope this one's not 50 pages. It's not. That will be the last one. Since I'm at 33 minutes. 9. The great day had come, the birthday of Die Welt. The first issue of Herzl's magazine appeared on Friday, June 4th, 1897. Public reaction was much like that which had greeted the publication of The Jewish State. Die Welt caused comment, even though it did not create a great sensation. It was received with varied emotions in different places. What does this magazine want? A Jewish state, a state consisting only of Jews, from its chief down to the lowliest shepherd. Ah, and which intonation this ah possessed depended on whether it came from the mouth of a liberal Jew or a Zionist or an anti Semite. Many had supposed that the popular light author Theodor Herzl would abandon the Jewish theme after that peculiar aberration, the Jewish state pamphlet, and return to writing beautiful, innocuous, completely non-political feuilletons. They were disappointed and astonished when Die Welt made its appearance. So he was serious, deadly serious, that strange man. He meant to pursue the matter, to continue riding his hobby horse. In fact, judging from all appearances, to turn the hobby horse into a real war horse. For proof, one had only to read the program, which he announced on the first page of his new weekly. There he said, "Our paper is a Jewish paper. We mean to take this expression, which is used as a term of abuse, and turn it into one of honor." Die Welt is a paper for Jews. For which Jews? For the strong who receive help anyway? No, they do not need support. Die Welt is a paper for the poor, the weak, the young, but also for all those who, while themselves not suffering affliction, have found their way home to their race. Let no one dare to say that we are fanning class hatred among Jews when we concern ourselves with our weaker brothers. There are men enough in our ranks who are neither proletarians nor revolutionists nor hotheads. The cause we serve is great and noble, a work of peace, a solution of the Jewish problem which will bring reconciliation, an idea capable of inspiring nobler human beings, whether they be Christian, Mohammedans, or Israelites. We wish, in the words which are already familiar to our friends, to create a homeland that is secured by international law for those Jews who cannot or do not want to assimilate in their present places of residence. We rally under the flag of Zion, yet through our eyes are fixed on a though our eyes are fixed on a distant goal, we cannot and shall not ignore the present day conditions of the Jews. Die Welt will serve the Jewish people as a sword and buckler, yes, and an unsullied sword. Against whom? Against its enemies without regard to religion. This was the tenor of Herzl's program, This was the tenor of Herzl's program, which occupied the entire first page of Die Welt and concluded with the sentence, "Die Welt will be the organ of those men who wish to lead the Jewish people upward from this era into better times." The program was signed editorial staff of Die Welt. It was appropriate, for Herzl was the editorial staff. Editor-in-chief, publisher, and owner, all in one. To the Zionist and many other Jews, the program sounded like the sort of manifesto one plasters on the walls in times of unrest and peril. This undertone which Herzl had imparted to his proclamation was most timely, for anti-Semitism was busily at work, and Israel was once more assailed by enemies. Herzl's outstanding literary ability was a great asset in his mission of reestablishing a Jewish state. No other Jew or even Jewish writer of that time could have framed the Welt program in such effective language. Herzl was a master of words, endowed with the gift of expressing what he thought and felt so that it conquered the minds and hearts of others. Among the many qualities which predestined Herzl for his role, his literary skill occupied an important place. After the first issue of Die Welt had seen the light of day, our office was moved from the Wiener Mode to Herzl's home. For hours and for days at a time, I sat with him in his study in the house at number 6 Berghaus. Herzl at his desk, I at an adjoining table. The work of helping to prepare the succeeding issues was enjoyable and easy, for Herzl made it so. Never did he don the formal robes of editor-in-chief or make one painfully conscious of his superiority. There was no trace of self-important aloofness. I always had the feeling that he was a fatherly friend who had my best interests at heart. Herzl was then 37, and I was 22, a gap which at my age might well have seemed formidable enough to justify thinking of him as fatherly. Those were wonderful days which rank among the happiest of my life. In addition to the private, unofficial editorial office on the Berghaus, we had an official address which was listed on the title page of Die Welt, Vienna 2, number 11, Rembrandtstrasse. That was, of course, the headquarters of the Zion Society, where I had made the speech that proved so fateful for me. Our magazine, particularly the business department, enjoyed the use of the premises as an indefinite guest. Herzl was an early riser. By the time I entered his study each morning between 8 and 8:30, he was sitting at his desk, a pen or pencil in his hand, his mind already preoccupied with matters pertaining to Judaism, to the Jewish state, to Die Welt. Once, when we were talking about a man who was known for sleeping until 10 in the morning and even later, Herzl said, "Mark my words, Rosenberger, a man who does not rise early will never amount to anything." My work at this time consisted of getting material for Die Welt's announcements column ready for the printer, reading galley proofs, and transcribing from my stenographic notes and the letters Herzl dictated to me. Since we did not have a typewriter then, to say nothing of a dictaphone, pen and ink constituted our principal writing materials. The letters were replies to Jewish individuals and organizations which had appeared to Herzl as the unchallengeable authority on matters concerning the Zionist idea. In the course of the morning, Frau Herzl usually paid us a short visit. She would come up wearing an ordinary dress with a friendly smile on her face, which sometimes showed just a trace of rice powder. After asking her husband how he was and exchanging a few words with him, she would return to the other part of the house. I still remember very clearly how on one occasion Frau Herzl stepped up behind her husband, who was sitting erect at his desk. "Why does everyone like you so much?" she asked tenderly, and then slowly pressed a kiss on the little spot where the crown of his head had begun to show through his otherwise thick hair. That's all for now. It's 42 minutes and 20 seconds. Goodbye, bruv.